My nephew Ethan was always a weird kid. Not in a bad way, just different. He's 6 now, lives with my sister Lauren in this old house in upstate New York. Big, creaky place with too many rooms and not enough light. I'd visit every couple of months, mostly to check in on Lauren after her divorce. Ethan's dad, Mike, was out of the picture by then, and I figured she could use the company. Plus, Ethan's a riot. Always babbling about something, half of it nonsense, half of it oddly specific. Like he'd tell you the exact number of steps from the kitchen to the front door. 27 if you're curious. Kid's got a brain like a steel trap. About a year ago, I started noticing he'd spend a lot of time in his room just talking. Not to himself exactly, it was more like a conversation. I'd hear him through the door, his little voice going back and forth, pausing, like he was waiting for answers. At first I thought it was an imaginary friend. Lauren did too. She'd shrug and say, "He's lonely, it's fine. Kids do this." And yeah, that made sense. Divorce messes with you, especially when you're that young. So we let it slide. But then it got specific. Ethan started calling it the shadow in the corner. He'd say it so casually, like it was a pet or something. "The shadow in the corner told me it's gonna rain today," he'd announce at breakfast. And, sure enough, the sky would turn gray by noon. Or, "The shadow in the corner says Grandma's coming over." And an hour later, Mom would pull into the driveway unannounced. Lauren laughed it off at first, calling him her little psychic. But I could tell it bugged her. Me too, if I'm honest. It wasn't just the predictions, it was how he'd sit there, cross-legged on his rug, staring at this one spot by his closet where the light never quite reached. Just a dark patch on the wall. Empty. Nothing there. I asked him about it once, maybe 6 months back. We were building a Lego spaceship on his floor, and he was chattering away like usual. I nodded at the corner and said, "So, what's this shadow buddy of yours look like, huh?" He didn't even glance up, just kept snapping pieces together. "It's a shadow," he said, like I was dumb for asking. "It's tall, and it moves sometimes, but only when I'm not looking." I chuckled, trying to play it cool, but my skin prickled. Kids say creepy stuff all the time, right? Doesn't mean anything. Things stayed quiet for a while after that. Lauren got a new job at the hospital, working nights, so I'd crash at her place more often to watch Ethan. He'd still talk to the corner, but it was background noise by then, like the hum of the fridge or the wind rattling the windows. I'd peek in sometimes, see him whispering, giggling, nodding like he was in on some secret. I never heard anything back, just his voice, small and bright, bouncing around that dim little room. Then last month it changed. It was a Friday night, cold as hell outside, snow piling up against the windows. Lauren was pulling a double shift, so it was just me and Ethan. We'd ordered pizza, watched some cartoon about singing animals, and I was half asleep on the couch when he tugged my sleeve. "Uncle Jake," he said, eyes big, "the shadow's talking now." I blinked at him, still groggy. "Talking, like out loud?" He nodded, dead serious. "Yeah, it's got a voice. Want to hear?" I should have said no. I wanted to say no. But he was already dragging me upstairs, barefoot on the hardwood, his Spider-Man pajamas glowing under the hall light. We got to his room, and he plopped down on the rug, patting the spot next to him. "Sit," he said. "It only talks if you're quiet." So I sat, feeling ridiculous, knees creaking like I was too old for this. The corner looked the same as always, dark, still, just a trick of the light where the wall met the closet door, nothing special. We waited. Ethan stared at it, unblinking like he was trying to will it to life. I was about to call it quits, tell him it was bedtime, when I heard it. A whisper. Low, raspy, like someone breathing words through a cracked window. "Ethan," it said. My stomach dropped. I whipped my head around hoping it was the TV downstairs or the wind or hell, even Lauren sneaking home early. But the house was silent except for that voice. "Ethan," it said again, sharper this time. He grinned at me like he'd just won a prize. "See? Told you." I don't scare easy. I've lived alone in sketchy apartments, worked late shifts, at gas stations even had a guy pull a knife on me once. But that voice, it made my bones feel cold. I grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him up. "Okay, bud, that's enough. Let's go downstairs." He frowned, tugging back. "But it's my friend. It talks to me all the time now." I didn't argue, just scooped him up and booked it to the living room, locking his door behind us. I called Lauren that night, told her everything. She sounded exhausted, skeptical, but promised to check it out when she got home. Next morning, she sat Ethan down at the kitchen table, all gentle but firm, and asked about the shadow. He wouldn't budge. "It's my friend," he kept saying. "It knows stuff, like where Dad went." That stopped us cold. Mike hadn't contacted anyone in over a year, just vanished after the papers were signed. Lauren's face went pale. "What do you mean, sweetie?" she asked. Ethan shrugged, poking at his cereal. "The shadow said he's in Florida, by the water." We didn't know what to do with that. Lauren tried calling Mike's old number. Disconnected. She even dug up his mom's contact, left a voicemail. Nothing came of it, and Ethan wouldn't say more. But the shadow kept talking. I'd hear it sometimes late at night when I stayed over, faint like it was testing me. "Jake," it'd rasp, just once, then go quiet. I stopped sleeping in the guest room after that, started crashing on the couch instead, closer to the front door. 2 weeks ago, things went sideways. Lauren woke up to Ethan gone, bed empty, window shut, house locked tight. She freaked, called me at 3 a.m., sobbing. I raced over and we searched every inch of that place. Basement, attic, even the damn crawl space. No sign of him. Police came, asked their questions, but you could tell they thought he'd wandered off. Then, as the sun came up, we heard it, giggling from his room. We ran upstairs and there he was, sitting on the rug, staring at the corner. "Where the hell were you?" Lauren yelled, grabbing him. He just smiled. With the shadow, it showed me Dad. Lauren lost it, started packing that day. Said she couldn't stay in that house anymore. I helped her move into a little apartment. In town, no corners like that one. Ethan's quieter now, doesn't talk about the shadow much. But yesterday I caught him staring at the wall behind the TV, head tilted like he was listening. I asked what he was doing. He didn't answer, just pointed at the spot and whispered, "It's still here." I don't know what to think anymore. Lauren's looking into therapists, maybe a priest. Me? I'm just hoping it stays a shadow and doesn't decide to show us something worse. When I was 13, my rowdy group of troublemaking friends and I used to stir up all sorts of mischief on Saturday nights. One of our favorite pranks, about 10 years ago, was playing Ding Dong Ditch. We all lived in the same suburban neighborhood, back then, a place with fewer houses and more woods than it has now. For this story, let's call my buddies Lucas, Nate, and Theo. Lucas and Nate were usually the ones bold enough to sneak up to a house and ring the doorbell, while Theo and I would scramble to find a hiding spot right away. We'd hit about 5 or 6 houses in a row. I remember the men who answered the doors all reacted in pretty much the same way. They'd step out onto their porches, some would yell something grumpy, and then they'd head back inside. At a couple of houses, we'd ring the bell again, just to get a bigger reaction. One guy shouted that he'd call the cops the second time we did it, so when he slammed the door, we bolted to the end of the street and moved on to the next block. Like I said, 10 years ago, this neighborhood had patches of woods where houses stand today. The next street we hit had a few wooded areas surrounding some of the homes, and the houses there didn't look particularly well kept. The first house on that block sat right across from a thick patch of trees, perfect for hiding. The place looked run down. Tall grass, an old beat-up car with a tarp over it in the driveway, and just an overall vibe of neglect. Lucas volunteered to ring the bell. He barely made it across the street before the door flew open. This guy wasn't like the others. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a solid build, and he was furious right off the bat. He stormed around his whole front yard, checking the bushes, yelling threats while we snickered from our hiding spot as usual. Eventually, he went back inside. Lucas waited a few minutes, peeked at the windows, then dashed back to the porch to ring the bell again. I wouldn't have had the guts to mess with that guy twice, but Lucas was fearless. He knew he didn't have much time, so he darted to the side of the house and out of sight. The door swung open even faster this time, and now the man stepped, out holding a rifle. We all exchanged wide-eyed looks, thinking the same thing. We're in deep trouble. He checked all the same spots as before, plus a few new ones, like behind his car and some trees. Then he walked to the middle of his lawn and just stood there like he was thinking. He scanned around and his gaze locked in our direction. Theo, Nate, and I crouched lower in the woods, praying he hadn't spotted us. After staring our way for what felt like 10 agonizing seconds, he turned back to the house. Then we saw him at the front window, standing still as a statue, peering toward us again. He'd caught Lucas creeping back to the door for one more ring, but we were too scared to move or shout a warning. Lucas hit the bell and bolted, but the man didn't budge, at least not for a minute. Then he disappeared from the window. We lost sight of Lucas and were too freaked out to do anything but stay put. Next thing I remember, Lucas yelled, "Run!" from across the street. We didn't get it until we heard footsteps crashing toward us from behind. Turning around, we saw the man charging across the road into the woods, rifle in hand, aimed right at us. We took off like scared rabbits, sprinting to where Lucas was waiting. We ran through blocks of houses until we were sure we'd lost him. Lucas explained he'd shouted when he saw the guy sneak across the street into the woods with the gun. We didn't report it or tell anyone official, just a few friends, that was it. Luckily, the house was far enough from ours that we never had to pass it again. Jake was a sophomore at this mid-sized university in the Midwest. Nothing fancy, just your typical college town with old brick buildings and too many bars. He'd been living in a rented house off campus with his buddy Sean, who he'd known since freshman year. Sean was a chill guy, engineering major, always tinkering with random gadgets, the kind of dude who'd fix your laptop without making a big deal out of it. They got along great, split the rent, kept the place decently clean, all that good stuff. Nothing weird about their setup, at least not at first. It started during finals week, late fall, when the days were short and the nights felt endless. Jake says he was pulling an all-nighter in the living room, surrounded by energy drink cans and his econ notes, when he heard Sean's bedroom door creak open upstairs. He didn't think much of it. Sean had a habit of grabbing midnight snacks, but then he heard footsteps coming down the stairs, slow and uneven, like someone wasn't fully awake. Jake looked up from his laptop and saw Sean standing at the bottom of the staircase, just staring. Not at Jake, but at nothing, like his eyes were locked on some invisible point in the room. "Dude, you okay?" Jake called out, figuring Sean was just zoned out from stress. No response. Sean didn't even blink. Then, out of nowhere, he started muttering, soft under his breath, like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. Jake couldn't make out the words at first. It sounded like gibberish, maybe a mix of English and something else, but it had this weird rhythm to it, almost like chanting. He got up, waved a hand in front of Sean's face. Nothing. That's when he realized Sean was sleepwalking. He'd heard of people doing weird stuff in their sleep, but seeing it up close? Totally different vibe. Jake didn't want to wake him. Someone had told him once that waking a sleepwalker could freak them out. So he just guided Sean back upstairs, nudging him toward his room. The muttering didn't stop, though. As they climbed the stairs, it got louder, more intense, and Jake swears it didn't sound like any language he'd ever heard. Not Spanish, not French. Nothing you'd pick up in a class. It was guttural, sharp, like something ancient. Sean flopped back into bed, still whispering, and eventually went quiet. Jake stood there for a minute, heart pounding, before heading back downstairs. He didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, Sean had no memory of it. Jake brought it up over breakfast, casual, like, "Hey, you were wandering around last night, talking in your sleep." Sean laughed it off, said he'd been having weird dreams lately but didn't think much of it. Jake let it go, figuring it was a one-time thing. Final stress, right? Everyone gets a little loopy. Except, it wasn't a one-time thing. Over the next couple of weeks, it kept happening. Not every night, but often enough that Jake started noticing a pattern. It'd be late, always past midnight, when he'd hear the creak of Sean's door, the slow thud of footsteps, and that creepy whispering. Sometimes Sean would just stand in the hallway, swaying slightly, muttering away. Other times he'd wander into the kitchen, grab a glass of water and drink it while staring at the wall, all without waking up. Jake tried recording it once on his phone, but the audio was too muffled to make anything out. Just a low, eerie hum of words that didn't make sense. Jake started getting paranoid. He'd lock his bedroom door at night, not because he thought Sean would hurt him, but because the whole thing was so unnerving. He looked up sleepwalking online. Apparently it's not that rare, and stress or bad sleep can trigger it. Sean had been burning the candle at both ends with school and a part-time job, so it tracked. Still, the language thing? That wasn't normal. Jake even asked a linguistics major friend to listen to one of his shaky recordings, but she couldn't place it either. Just said it sounded weirdly structured and left it at that. Things escalated right after winter break. They'd both gone home for a couple of weeks, and Jake was hoping the reset would stop whatever was going on. But the first night back, it happened again, only worse. Jake woke up to the sound of the front door slamming shut. He bolted out of bed, thinking someone had broken in, but when he got downstairs, the house was empty. Sean's shoes were gone, his jacket too. It was 2 a.m., freezing outside and snowing hard. Jake threw on his coat and ran out, yelling Sean's name into the dark. He found footprints in the snow leading down the street. Barefoot prints, uneven, like Sean wasn't walking straight. Jake followed them, heart racing, calling out every few steps. The trail went about 2 blocks, then veered into this wooded lot near their house, an overgrown patch of trees and brush that nobody ever went into. The snow was coming down thicker now, blurring the tracks, but Jake could still see them heading deeper in. He kept going, phone flashlight shaking in his hand, until the prints just stopped. Right in the middle of the lot, no Sean, no nothing, just snow and silence. Jake freaked out. He called Sean's phone. No answer. He called 911, told them his roommate had wandered off in his sleep and was missing. The cops showed up, searched the area, but the snow had covered everything by then. They asked Jake a ton of questions. Did Sean do drugs? Was he depressed? Any enemies? Jake said no to all of it, but he could tell they didn't fully believe him. They filed a report, told him to call if Sean turned up, and that was it. Sean didn't turn up. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. His phone was off, his social media went silent, and his family, who lived halfway across the country, hadn't heard from him either. Jake moved out of the house a month later. He couldn't handle staying there alone, always wondering if he'd hear footsteps again. The official story was that Sean had a mental breakdown or ran off, but Jake doesn't buy it. He keeps going back to that night. The whispering, the barefoot tracks, the way they just stopped. He even went to the lot again in daylight, looking for anything the cops might have missed. Nothing. Just trees and dirt. Here's where it gets weirder, though. A few months ago, Jake got an email from an old classmate who'd lived in that same house years before. The guy had seen a missing person post Jake shared online and reached out. He said he'd had a roommate who sleepwalked too. Same deal, muttering in some freaky language, wandering at night. That guy didn't vanish, but he moved out after waking up in the backyard one morning with no memory of how he got there. Jake's been digging into the house's history since then, but so far it's just dead ends. Old tenant records, no red flags. So, what happened to Sean? Jake doesn't know, and honestly, neither do I. Could have been a breakdown, could have been something medical, or maybe, just maybe, something else. That's the thing with these stories. Sometimes there's no neat ending, just a bunch of questions that keep you up at night. What do you guys think? Ever dealt with a sleepwalker or something creepier? Hit me up in the comments. A few weeks ago, I was living in a house straight out of a nightmare. I'm a college student, and my parents had rented me a modest place to stay. Nothing fancy, just a simple home in decent shape. I was fine with it for the first few days. But then things got weird fast. One rainy Saturday with nothing to do, I'd been watching TV for hours. That's when I heard a scratching sound on the living room floor. I glanced around, thinking maybe an animal had gotten inside, but saw nothing. I shrugged it off and kept watching. It rained all day and into the night, giving me an excuse to stay in. I was back in the living room, feeling a little jumpy, when I thought I heard something from the kitchen. Laughing at myself, I grabbed a pillow like that'd do anything and went to check. In the dark kitchen, there was a box of Cheerios spilled all over the floor, hundreds of little O's scattered everywhere. I had no clue how it happened. I dropped the pillow, cleaned it up, and as I did, I heard a creak, like someone stepping on a weak spot in the wooden floor, near the kitchen table. I looked up. Nothing there. I was starting to feel like I was losing it. The storm got louder outside, thunder rumbling overhead, but I found it oddly relaxing. That's the last thing I remember before dozing off for an hour-long nap. The TV was still on when I woke up, but that's not what stirred me. I swore I'd heard a bang or a thud from downstairs. Whatever it was, I turned off the TV and headed upstairs to bed. The next couple of days were normal, until the next gray, rainy day rolled around and the weirdness kicked back in. That morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been drinking all night. Sick, worse than any hangover I'd ever had. The gloomy weather just made me stay in bed more. I kept the bedroom TV on all day for background noise, with a trash can nearby in case I got sick. Around noon, I muted the TV after hearing sounds from above me. The attic. The attic door was right in my bedroom, and most of the space stretched over it. I heard it not once but 3 or 4 times. Despite feeling awful, I dragged myself out of bed, grabbed an old baseball bat and pulled down the attic door. I climbed the stairs, flipped on the light, and saw a few dusty boxes, probably from the previous owner, but no living thing making noise. I hurried back down, spooked by the place. No more sounds until that night. I woke up, still queasy, thinking it was thunder at first. Then a loud thud from the attic sent a chill through me. I yanked the attic door open again, bat in hand, and climbed up. I yelled in my scariest voice, but before I could hit the light, I heard a child's giggle in the pitch-black space. No words can capture that feeling, the weightless dread, the terror sinking into me. It was beyond fear. I bolted out of that house so fast I don't even remember running. In the cold rain, I called my dad, begging him to pick me up. I explained as best I could. My parents saw how shaken I was, and, in some strange way, I think they believed me. We packed my stuff the next day and I moved back home. To this day, I'm convinced what I experienced in that house was downright supernatural. Sarah's a single mom in her early 30s, living in a quiet little suburb in Ohio. Picture those classic American neighborhoods, rows of two-story houses, big front yards, kids riding bikes down the street after school. Nothing fancy, but it's safe, you know? Or at least it's supposed to be. She'd moved into this place about a year ago with her 6-year-old daughter Lily after a rough divorce. It was a fresh start for them, and Sarah said she loved how peaceful it felt at first. The house wasn't huge, just a cozy 3-bedroom with a little porch out front. But it was theirs. Next door was this older house, kind of run down compared to the rest of the street. The paint was peeling, the grass was overgrown, and the windows always had these thick, dusty curtains drawn shut. Sarah didn't think much of it at first. She figured it was just empty or maybe owned by some elderly person who didn't get out much. Her neighbor on the other side, this friendly older guy named Tom, told her no one had lived there in years. Apparently, the last owner passed away, and the place had been tied up in some legal mess ever since. So it just sat there, collecting cobwebs. Everything was fine for the first few months. Sarah worked from home doing customer service calls. Lily started school, and life was pretty routine. But then around late fall, something weird started happening. It was subtle at first, so subtle Sarah brushed it off. She'd be in the living room at night watching TV after Lily went to bed, and she'd get this feeling, like someone was watching her. You know that prickly sensation you get on the back of your neck? She'd look around, check the windows, but nothing. Just the usual shadows from the streetlights outside. One night, though, it got real. It was a Thursday, probably around 9 p.m. Sarah was curled up on the couch with a blanket, half watching some true crime show. Ironic, right? She glanced up at the window facing the side yard, the one that looked right at the neighbor's house. And there he was. A man, just standing there, staring at her through the glass. Sarah froze. She said her heart started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The guy wasn't moving, just this dark silhouette against the faint glow of the streetlights. She couldn't make out his face, but she could feel his eyes locked on her. It wasn't like he was trying to break in or anything. He was just watching. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, she jumped up, ran to the window, and yanked the curtains shut. When she peeked out a minute later, he was gone. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light, or some teenager messing around. But deep down, she knew what she saw. She double-checked the locks that night, made sure Lily was safe in her room and barely slept. The next morning, she called her brother, Mike, who lived about an hour away. He's one of those no-nonsense guys who's always ready to play the protective big brother. Mike told her to call the cops if it happened again, but since nothing technically happened, no break-in, no threats, she didn't want to overreact. A couple of nights later, it happened again. Same time, same window. This time Sarah was ready. She'd left her phone on the coffee table, and the second she saw that figure outside, she grabbed it and snapped a picture. The flash went off, lighting up the room, and she saw him flinch, like he wasn't expecting it. He bolted before she could get a good look, but when she checked the photo, there he was. Blurry, sure, but definitely a person. A man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and maybe a hood. She couldn't see his face, but that image made it real. This wasn't her imagination. Freaked out, Sarah called Mike again, and he drove over the next day. They decided to check out the neighbor's house. It was broad daylight, so it didn't feel too risky. They walked up to the front porch, knocked on the door, no answer. The windows were still covered, and the whole place had this eerie, abandoned vibe. Mike even tried peering through a gap in the curtains, but it was too dark inside to see anything. They talked to Tom, the neighbor on the other side, and he was just as confused. "No one's been in there," he said. "I'd have noticed." He'd lived there for 20 years and swore the place was empty. Sarah wasn't buying it. She'd seen this guy twice now, and both times, he was right there, steps away from that house. She called the police that afternoon. 2 officers showed up, took her statement, and checked out the neighbor's property. They didn't find much, no footprints, no signs of anyone living there. One of them suggested it could be a homeless person squatting, but the doors were locked, and there was, no trash or anything to back that up. They promised to patrol the area more often and told her to call if she saw him again. For a week, nothing happened. Sarah started to relax, thinking maybe the guy got spooked and moved on. But then came the twist that still gives me chills. One night, Lily, who'd been completely oblivious to all this, came downstairs while Sarah was making dinner. She tugged on Sarah's sleeve and said, "Mommy, who's the man in my room?" Sarah dropped the spoon she was holding. "What man, sweetie?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Lily pointed upstairs and said, "The one by my window, he was looking at me." Sarah's stomach dropped. Lily's room was on the second floor. There's no balcony, no tree close enough to climb, just a straight drop to the ground. She ran upstairs with Lily trailing behind, flipped on the light and checked the window. It was locked from the inside, no scratches, no smudges. But when she looked out, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A faint handprint on the outside of the glass, too high up for anyone to reach without a ladder. She called the cops again, and this time they took it more seriously. They dusted for prints, checked the yard, even brought a ladder to inspect the roof. Nothing. No ladder marks, no way anyone could have gotten up there. The handprint was real, though. Fresh, clear, and human. The officer's best guess? Maybe a reflection or a prank. But Sarah wasn't convinced. Reflections don't leave prints. Things got weirder. A few days later, Tom knocked on her door, looking shaken. He said he'd been up late the night before and saw a light flicker inside the empty house just for a second, like someone turned a flashlight on and off. He'd never seen that before, in all his years living there. Sarah started to wonder if someone was sneaking in and out, but how? And why? The breaking point came a week later. Sarah woke up at 3 a.m. to a tapping sound. It was faint but steady, coming from downstairs. She grabbed a baseball bat she'd started keeping by her bed and crept down the stairs. The noise was coming from the living room window, the same one where she'd first seen the man. Tap, tap, tap. She edged closer, her hands shaking, and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out. He was there, face pressed against the glass, staring right at her. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth was twisted into this creepy half-smile. Sarah screamed and swung the bat at the window out of pure instinct, shattering the glass. The guy stumbled back and ran off into the dark. She called 911, sobbing, and the cops were there in minutes. They searched the neighborhood, but he was gone. Here's where it gets insane. The next day, a detective showed up with news. They'd finally tracked down the owner of the empty house, a distant relative who lived out of state. When they contacted her, she said something that turned Sarah's world upside down. The house wasn't supposed to be empty. Her brother, a guy named Daniel, had been living there off and on for months. He'd struggled with mental health issues, disappeared from family radar, and they'd assumed he'd moved out. But when the police searched the house, really searched it this time, they found signs someone had been there. A sleeping bag in the attic, empty food cans, a flashlight, and a notebook. Inside were pages of scribbled notes about Sarah, her schedule, what she wore, even what Lily said at the bus stop. Daniel was gone by the time they figured it out. No one knows where he went, but Sarah wasn't sticking around to find out. She moved in with Mike the next week and put her house up for sale. Last she heard, the cops were still looking for him, but he's a ghost. Sarah sent me that blurry photo she took, and I've got it up on the screen now if you're watching. The video version. It's not much, but it's enough to make your skin crawl. She says she still has nightmares about those eyes through the window. Can't say I blame her. So what do you think? Ever had something like this happen near you? Let me know in the comments, and if you've got your own story, send it my way. Until next time, stay safe out there and maybe double check your windows tonight. When I was 20, I worked as a helper for an elderly woman named Vera for a few weeks. She had a huge but old house on a piece of land that could have been beautiful. She actually took care of it. The property spanned 2 acres, surrounded by woods on 3 sides and a road on the 4th. The house itself was ancient, mostly wood, and really dark inside. Vera kept the curtains closed in some rooms for reasons I never understood. I'd sometimes open them to let in sunlight, only to find she'd close them again the next time I walked in. She lit candles in certain rooms, making the place feel even more prehistoric to me. The wooden floors creaked everywhere. An ecologist's nightmare. Vera was about 70. The tasks she gave me were mostly manual stuff she couldn't handle anymore. Sweeping, washing dishes, doing laundry, sorting mail, things like that. One weekend, she asked me to stay over for a night or 2. The house had 4 bedrooms and she lived alone, so it wasn't an issue. This was over Friday and technically all of Saturday. I showed up as usual on Friday, exchanging few words with Vera. I set my backpack, packed with clothes and toiletries, on the bed in the guest room where I'd sleep. When I turned to the door, Vera was standing there. She had a creepy demeanor, and this entrance was no exception. She didn't greet me, which wasn't as odd as you'd think. She just told me to clean the bedroom, then the whole house before heading upstairs. I didn't see her for the rest of the day, though I'd occasionally hear her pacing in her room above. It was strange. She seemed to just walk back and forth. There was no TV in the house, so I had no clue what she could have been doing. One thing that struck me as odd was how protective she was of her basement. She made it crystal clear it was off limits and that she didn't want me down there. Night fell, and I went to bed early. Smartphones weren't a thing yet, so I didn't even know the exact time, maybe 9 or 10. For the first few hours, everything was calm, but I struggled to sleep because it was the most uncomfortable bed I'd ever lain on. Finally, what felt like hours later, I started hearing footsteps outside my room on the creaky floor. It sounded like Vera passing by really slowly, maybe heading to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, but this time they stopped at my door. I sat up and listened. I could hear the floor creaking behind the door where she stood, and it started to freak me out. Eventually, she walked away. I heard her go downstairs, then a door open and close below. I had a hunch it was the basement door. A while later, I heard it open and close again, followed by slow, heavy footsteps coming back up the stairs. The footsteps stopped at my door again. I sat up to listen, hearing the creak of pressure on the floor outside. Then the doorknob started turning. I lay back down, pulled the blankets over me, and pretended to sleep. Vera took a few steps into the room, paused, then turned and left, closing the door. I was baffled. This was seriously weird behavior. I waited about half an hour before deciding I had to see what was in that basement. I crept out of the squeaky bed, tiptoed to the door, and carefully made my way downstairs. I opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the light, and snuck down the steps. When I reached the bottom, I had to stifle a scream. In the middle of the basement were two old wooden chairs, and on them were two things I can only describe as decaying corpses, with wigs on their heads. Seeing a bug crawl across one of them made me want to puke even more. I told myself to go deeper into the basement, closer to the bodies, to make sure they were real. Both had men's wigs. One even wore a beret. I don't know much about corpses, or how fast they decompose, but I'd guess these were nearly a year old. My heart stopped for a second when I heard footsteps from upstairs heading to the first floor. I couldn't reach the light switch. I didn't have time. I hid behind a couch in the basement as slow, heavy footsteps came down. Peeking out, I saw Vera, halfway across the basement, holding a big kitchen knife. She whispered my name. I covered my mouth to keep quiet. I knew she'd be too slow to catch me, so I bolted for the stairs. She screamed my name and chased after me as fast as she could. I raced upstairs to the guest room, grabbed my backpack, and when I ran back down, Vera was at the top of the basement stairs. I sprinted out the front door to my car. I started the engine, catching my breath, and looked back at the house. Vera was standing at the door. I drove off that sprawling property and down the road home in 10 minutes flat. Luckily, I'd never given Vera my address or phone number, so she couldn't contact me again. If I had to guess, I'd say one of those corpses was her dead husband. She'd mentioned him twice. As for the smaller one, I have no idea. Either way, it was a disturbing sight, and there was something deeply off about that woman. My friend Lucas and I decided to escape into the woods for a camping trip over the weekend. We both needed a break from the chaos of city life, and it was supposed to be an exciting adventure, just the two of us reconnecting with nature. We set up our tent deep in the forest, far from any trails or other campers. The night was quiet, with only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. We'd just finished roasting marshmallows over the campfire, laughing and reminiscing about old times, when we heard a faint rustling outside the tent. Lucas and I exchanged a glance, figuring it might be a raccoon or a deer, but it didn't sound like the usual forest noises. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, and then we heard a voice, a low, almost silent whisper, muttering just beyond the tent. My heart pounded as I strained to make out the words. "Let me in," it said. Frozen, we grabbed our flashlights, ready to confront whoever or whatever was out there. "Who's there?" we called, but the voice didn't respond. It just kept repeating, "Let me in." Lucas slowly unzipped the tent, revealing a tall figure standing a few feet away. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face shrouded in shadow. "Let me in," he said again, his voice a strange mix of desperation and menace. We were rattled but decided to help. Maybe he was lost or in trouble. Lucas opened the tent wider, and the stranger stepped inside. Up close, he looked unnerving. Dirty clothes, wild eyes darting around anxiously. We asked if he was okay, but he didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at us with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. The air grew thick with tension as Lucas and I shared uneasy glances. Suddenly, the stranger's gaze locked onto me. He leaned in close, his hot breath on my neck, and hissed, "Let me in." I recoiled in fear, and that's when I saw it. A knife clutched in his hand, glinting ominously in the dim light. Panic surged through me. Lucas and I locked eyes, a silent agreement passing between us. Without a word, we bolted for the tent's edge, shoving past the intruder. We ran through the forest, hearts racing, not daring to look back. When we finally reached our car, the memory of that eerie whisper and the gleam of the blade still haunted us. We didn't know what the stranger wanted, and we didn't care to find out. What was supposed to be a relaxing getaway had turned dark and chilling, an encounter we'd never forget. My buddy Theo and I have been camping together since we were kids, every summer without fail. Armed with trusty gear and our unshakable friendship, we'd venture into the wilderness. This year, we decided to take our adventure to the next level, exploring a remote spot recommended online by other campers. It was a hidden gem, tucked deep in untamed nature. The dense forest surrounded us like an impenetrable wall, and it felt peaceful, almost too quiet. We pitched our tent near a pristine river, and the first few nights were flawless. We marveled at the raw beauty of the wild, swapping stories by the campfire under a starry sky. But on the fourth night, things took a chilling turn. We jolted awake to a strange sound, a distant dragging noise echoing through the trees. We exchanged wary looks but brushed it off as some wandering animal. Yet the sound kept creeping closer, growing louder with each passing moment. Curiosity got the better of us, and we grabbed our flashlights to investigate. Venturing into the dark forest, our footsteps muffled by thick leaves, the dragging turned into anguished cries. That's when we stumbled upon a horrifying scene. 3 shadowy figures looming over a helpless person, their savage intent clear in their brutal movements. Shock rooted us to the spot as we watched, but we couldn't just stand by. In a reckless split-second decision, we intervened. Our flashlights pierced the darkness, exposing us to the attackers. The moment they saw us, their twisted faces broke into sinister grins, a sight that made my blood run cold. Without a word, they abandoned their victim and turned toward us. Panic hit hard as we realized the mess we'd stumbled into. We spun around and ran, but it was too late. They gave chase through the tangled undergrowth, their footsteps pounding behind us in the night. Branches scratched at our skin, our breaths ragged as we fought to escape the relentless pursuit. Their wicked laughter grew louder, and it was clear they relished the hunt. We stumbled, and I could hear Theo's frantic whispers urging me on. Bursting back into our campsite clearing, we saw them closing in, their frenzied energy chilling me to the bone. In a desperate bid for survival, we rummaged through our gear, swinging tools as makeshift weapons. The attackers hesitated, wary of our defiance. It was a tense standoff in the dead of night, a battle of wills between seasoned campers and these vicious strangers. We didn't know who they were or what drove their cruelty, but we were determined to fight back. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they finally retreated into the forest, vanishing like shadows. Exhausted and trembling, we watched them go, vowing never to return to that cursed place. Our love for camping had led us to the edge of a nightmare, and we'd barely escaped a fate too horrific to dwell on. Life's a relentless grind for me and my girlfriend Mia. My days blur together as an IT consultant while Mia juggles chaos at a busy bakery. Worn out, we craved an escape from the daily slog. One fateful weekend while browsing a discount store, we spotted a cheap tent on display. Swapping screens for starry skies felt irresistible, so we snagged it without a second thought. A quick online search led us to a secluded retreat, a tranquil lake 2 hours from the city, nestled in the wilderness. The photos promised an oasis of peace, the perfect antidote to our stress. Excitement buzzed as we packed our meager camping gear and hit the road early Saturday. The drive was smooth, winding deeper into the wild as the city faded behind us. When we arrived, the lake's stillness greeted us, its surface mirroring the dense forest around it. Our tent stood alone by the water's edge, a symbol of solitude. It was paradise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit a campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories under a dazzling sky. But as night deepened, our retreat began to shift. Odd sounds drifted from the darkness, whispers on the wind, faint rustling in the bushes. Mia gripped my arm, her eyes wide with unease. We brushed it off as our imaginations running wild, blaming the nocturnal chatter of wildlife. Then a chilling, rhythmic chant rose from the forest, growing louder with each passing minute. Torn between curiosity and dread, we grabbed our flashlights and ventured in, following the haunting sound. The path grew tangled and dark until we stumbled upon a bone-chilling sight. A group of hooded figures circled an ancient, shadowy altar, chanting in an unfamiliar tongue. Their voices carried an otherworldly dread. These weren't ordinary campers, they were part of something far more sinister. We'd unknowingly crashed their ritual, drawn to this remote lake for reasons we couldn't fathom. Trembling, we tried to slip away, but a twig snapped underfoot. The hooded figures turned, their eyes glowing unnaturally in the dark. They advanced with slow, deliberate steps. Mia and I bolted, terror driving us back to camp. The hooded pursuers followed, their nightmarish presence closing in. We reached our tent, the chants still ringing in our ears, and frantically gathered our things. Abandoning the site, we raced to the car, the road back to the city a blurry sprint. The weight of that eerie encounter lingered, shattering the peace we'd sought. Our long-awaited getaway had spiraled into the unknown, a stark reminder that nature's solitude can hide secrets darker than any urban chaos. Camping was meant to be a weekend escape with my 5 closest friends, Nora, Jasper, Finn, Milo, and me. We ventured deep into the forest to ditch the daily grind and city noise, expecting a weekend of bonding and adventure. But it turned into a nightmarish ordeal. Trouble started as darkness fell. Gathered around the campfire, sharing laughs and stories, the crackling flames cast strange shadows among the towering trees. Then we heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes. We swapped puzzled looks, chalking it up to typical forest sounds. But the rustling grew closer, more persistent. Curiosity piqued. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped into the dark, beams slicing through the oppressive gloom. We scoured the area for the source but found nothing. The forest went dead silent, as if it had swallowed the noise whole. Shaking, off the unease, we returned to the fire, joking about wildlife and ghost stories to convince ourselves we were in control. As night wore on and we retreated to our tents, the sounds returned, different this time. Whispers, eerie and nonsensical, seemed to encircle us. Huddled together, we tried to make sense of the garbled words, fear sinking into our bones. These weren't natural noises. They were deliberate, close, and chilling. Panic set in as we debated. A prank? or something darker. With shaky hands, we decided we couldn't stay another minute. We tore down the tent and packed in the dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Every rustling leaf and snapping twig fueled our haste. Finally loaded up, we headed for the car, only to find all 4 tires slashed, headlights revealing the grim truth. Dread washed over us as we realized we were stranded, miles from help. The whispers grew louder, more menacing, echoing through the night. With no choice, we abandoned the car and set out on foot, guided only by the faint glow of our flashlights. The forest closed in, the darkness suffocating, every sound a lurking threat. Hours dragged as exhaustion weighed us down, stumbling through, the wild with no clear direction, just the desperate need to escape. When dawn broke, we stumbled upon a ranger station. Our cries for help were met with relief and disbelief. That ordeal shook our faith in nature's peace, leaving us haunted by a night we'd never forget. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror awaiting me on a camping trip with my friends Zara, Owen, and Lex. We were seasoned campers, or so we thought, thrilled by the challenge of a remote lake nestled deep in a dense forest. Locals whispered about the place, calling it too creepy to visit, but we craved adventure and the isolation thrilled us. The drive was uneventful, winding roads pulling us far from civilization. We set up camp by the still waters, a strange quiet settling over us. The lake's inky blackness mirrored the surrounding trees, a void that seemed to swallow sound. The first night passed smoothly, but the next day brought an oppressive stillness clinging to the air like a shroud. We fished and explored, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness fell, that quiet turned unsettling, the world holding its breath. Around the campfire, staring into the impenetrable dark, it began, a faint, haunting melody carried on the wind like a mournful lullaby. We scanned the trees with flashlights, finding nothing. The music was everywhere and nowhere, seeping into our tents as we tried to sleep. It burrowed into our minds, stirring a primal fear. Sleep eluded us, pinned down by the eerie tune. Then came whispers, voices dancing just beyond comprehension, followed by footsteps circling us. Driven by dread, we ventured out, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The whispers led us to the lake's edge, where a weathered rowboat rocked against a rotting dock. Inside, we found a battered journal filled with cryptic symbols and the ravings of a madman. The whispers seemed to rise from the lake itself, hiding secrets too awful to grasp. Zara reached for the water, but yanked her hand back from its icy grip. As we turned to leave, the surface rippled, and shadowy, distorted figures emerged from the depths. Panic seized us. We sprinted back to camp, the melody swelling into a deafening wail. The darkness from the lake chased us, coalescing into a nightmarish form reaching for us. The forest twisted, trees warping to block our escape. Trapped in a surreal nightmare, we endured until morning broke. We found ourselves by the lake again, the terror gone, the water calm. Packing up, our faces etched with horror, we'd brushed against an ancient, malevolent force lurking beneath the lake's serene surface.